The needle was still warm. I stood in the doorway of her quarters, if you could call them that, a narrow room beside the linen stores where the cold crept in through the stones, and stared at the workbench she had left behind. A half-finished war banner lay spread across the oak, the crimson thread of Dunmarin's wolf sigil stitched halfway through its snarl. The needle was pushed into the cloth at the jaw, exactly where she would have paused mid-stitch, and when I touched the steel, it still held the faint warmth of her hand. She had been here less than an hour ago. The bed was stripped. The small cedar chest, the only piece of furniture she owned outright, was gone. No note. No folded letter on the pillow, no bitter farewell scratched into the wood the way I had seen soldiers leave their last words. Ilara Wynne had simply stood up from her bench, set her needle, packed her chest, and walked out of Dunmarin in the dark. I told myself it was nothing. She was the banner stitcher, a quiet woman who mended war standards and kept the ceremonial draperies in order, who moved through the keep like a shadow the torches didn't bother to throw. I had seen her 1,000 times, and noticed her perhaps a dozen kneeling in the great hall to repair a torn pennant after a storm, carrying bolts of dyed wool up the stairs with her arms full and her chin tucked, sitting in the courtyard with thread between her teeth and the afternoon light catching the copper in her hair. She had been part of Dunmarin the way the hearthstones were part of it, present, dependable, invisible. And now she was gone, and the betrothal to Lady Vessa of Thornwall had been announced before the full court not 8 hours ago, and I refused to connect the two. My wolf stirred when I picked up the unfinished banner, a low, uneasy pull behind my ribs, like a rope drawn tight against a current. I set the banner down and left the room. I had a kingdom to secure. The alliance with Thornwall was sound. Vessa's father controlled the southern pass, the only route our enemies in the Ashward Reach could use to bring a raiding force into Dunmarin's heartland. 3 years of border skirmishes had bled us. We needed the pass sealed, and Redane of Thornwall would only seal it for a bride price. His daughter was handsome, well-spoken, educated in the old courtesies. She would make a capable Luna. My council approved. The elders approved. Dunmarin's wolves would be fed through the winter because the southern grain road would open. It was the right choice. My wolf disagreed in ways I did not yet understand, and so I ignored it, because I was Brennan Kale, Alpha King of the Highland border, and I had fought border wars since I was 17, and I did not have the luxury of listening to an instinct I could not name. The wedding was held 6 weeks later in Dunmarin Stone Hall. Vessa wore white fur over gray silk. The court stood. The old words were spoken. I bit the oath mark into the inside of my wrist, the shallow cut that binds an alpha to his mate in law, if not in bond, and when it healed within the hour, as it should, I noticed that the scar was thin and pale and carried no warmth. Mate bonds, the real ones, leave a mark that burns. Everyone knows this. The mark should have sung. Mine was silent. I told myself that bonds take time, that political matches kindle slowly, that the old stories about the mark flaring gold on first sight were fireside tales meant for women who still believed in destiny. Vessa moved into the Alpha's quarters. She was gracious and organized. She restructured the kitchens, hired a new steward, and sorted the keep's accounts with an efficiency that made my treasurer weep with gratitude. She was a fine partner in governance. She was not my mate. I knew it within the first month, though I would not say it aloud for nearly 3 years. There was no pull when she entered a room, no catch in my chest when she spoke. My wolf did not rise to her voice, did not settle at her scent, did not do any of the 1,000 small things the old lore promises when the true bond is present. He simply endured and grew restless. By the end of the first year, I could not sleep a full night. My wolf paced inside me like a caged thing, pressing against my ribs, turning my dreams into corridors I didn't recognize and rooms I had never entered. I would wake gasping, my hand pressed flat to my chest, a scent on the edge of my memory that vanished the moment I opened my eyes, something warm and herbal and faintly metallic, like rosemary steeped in copper. I never identified it. I only knew it left me hollow when it faded. Vesa noticed. She said nothing about it, because she was practical and composed, but I saw the way her mouth tightened when I flinched away from her touch without meaning to, and I understood that she was quietly measuring the distance between what this marriage was supposed to be and what it had become. I owed her honesty. I gave her courtesy instead, which is what cowards give when honesty would cost them something. The second year was worse. The banners began to fray. It started with the Great Hall Standard, the oldest one, the massive crimson and charcoal banner that hung behind the Alpha seat. A thread pulled loose along the wolf's jaw, exactly where Alara's needle had paused that last night. The new stitcher, a competent man named Perrin whom the steward had hired from the northern market towns, repaired it twice. Each time, the thread pulled free within a week, as if the fabric itself refused the mending. Then the corridor pennants, then the war standards in the armory. Thread by thread, stitch by stitch, Dunmerran's banners unraveled. Perrin swore the wool was sound, the dye was set, the weave was tight. He could find no reason for it, and when he stitched the Great Hall Standard a third time and the thread unwound overnight, unwound in a perfect spiral, as if pulled by an invisible hand, he asked to be released from his contract and left Dunmerran before dawn. I stood in the Great Hall that morning and looked up at the half-bare banner above my seat. The wolf's jaw was gone. The crimson field gaped where Alara's meticulous stitchwork had held it together for years, and the fabric beneath was raw and pale, like a wound with the bandage stripped. Something behind my ribs pulled tight, and my wolf made a sound I had never heard from him. Not a growl, not a howl, but a thin, low keen, the sound a creature makes when it has lost something it cannot name. I pressed my fist to my sternum and went a deal with the Ashward border patrols. The border held. Thornwall's pass stayed closed to our enemies. The alliance functioned. But inside the keep, things continued to fray, not just the banners, but the fabric of the place itself. Doors that had always closed flush began to stick. The hearthstones in the Great Hall cracked along lines that followed no fault in the stone. The courtyard well, which had given clear water for 6 generations, turned faintly brackish for 3 days in autumn and then cleared, as if testing whether anyone would notice. The wolves noticed. Dunmerran's pack wolves, the great gray Highland wolves who patrolled the border with us and slept in the lower halls, grew agitated. They circled the keep at night. They whined at closed doors. My lead wolf, a scarred old male named Thorn who had been with me since my father's time, began sitting outside the door of the room where Alara had lived, pressing his nose to the gap beneath the wood, breathing in whatever trace of her still lingered in the stone. I ordered the door sealed. Thorn sat outside it anyway. By the 3rd year, I was not sleeping at all. My wolf's pacing had become a constant pressure, a restless fury that turned my temper sharp and my patience thin. I snapped at my captains. I rode the borders too hard and too often, driving my horse until it lathered, then driving myself on foot through the heather until my legs burned and my lungs ached, and the roaring in my chest dimmed to a tolerable hum. Vesa found me one evening in the armory, oiling a blade I had already oiled twice, and she sat down across from me and folded her hands and said, quietly, "Brennan, I am not your mate." I stopped oiling the blade. "I have known it since the first week," she said. "Your wolf has never once settled for me. I thought it might come in time. My mother's bond with my father took nearly a year to kindle, and theirs was a strong one. But this is not slow kindling. This is absence. There is no bond here, and we both know why." I set the blade down. The alliance holds regardless. My father sealed the pass for Dunmerran's grain and garrison, not for a marriage bed. He is a strategist, not a romantic. She paused. But I will not spend a 4th year watching you tear yourself apart for a woman whose name you will not say. The silence in the armory was absolute. "I don't know what you mean," I said. "Alara win," Vesa said, and my wolf slammed against my ribs so hard I gripped the edge of the table. "The Bannerstitcher who vanished the night you announced our betrothal, the woman whose scent is still in the walls of this keep 3 years later, the one your wolves sit vigil for." She looked at me with the calm, clear gaze of a woman who had made her peace with a truth I was still running from. "You are soul bonded to her, Brennan. You have been since before I arrived. And whatever you chose with your head, your wolf chose her, and he has been howling for her every night since she left." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say it was impossible, that I had seen Alara 1,000 times and felt nothing, that the bond would have announced itself, that a man cannot be mated to a woman he barely noticed. But the mark on my wrist, the oath mark I had bitten for Vesa, had never warmed. And somewhere in the keep, a half-finished banner held the shape of a wolf's jaw in crimson thread, and my wolves sat outside a sealed door, and every instinct in my body had been screaming a name for 3 years that I had refused to hear. "I don't know where she went," I said. "Then find her," Vesa stood. "I will speak to my father about the terms the pass will hold. Dunmarin's obligations to Thornwall can be restructured without a marriage bond. I will see to it." At the door she paused. "She left you, Brennan, without a word, without a scene. She didn't fight for you. She simply walked away. That is either the coldest thing a woman can do to a man or the most dignified. I suspect with her it was the latter. She left the armory, and I sat alone with the oiled blade and the silence and 3 years of waste pressing down on my shoulders like armor I couldn't unbuckle. The next morning, I went to Alara's old room. The door was still sealed. Thorn was still sitting outside it, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. He looked up at me when I broke the seal, and there was no judgment in his eyes, only patience. The enormous, unjudging patience of a wolf who has been waiting for his alpha to stop being a fool. The room smelled of dust and old stone, and beneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, rosemary and copper, the scent from my dreams. The workbench was as she had left it, the half-finished banner, the needle in the wolf's jaw. I had ordered the room sealed 3 years ago, and no one had touched it since. I picked up the banner. My wolf went quiet. Not calm quiet. The difference is vast. For 3 years he had been a storm inside me, a howling, pacing, snarling thing that I had wrestled every waking hour. And now, with Alara's unfinished banner in my hands, the thread she had touched against my palms, he stopped. He pressed forward not in rage, but in recognition. He pressed his awareness into my hands and breath through my lungs, and I could feel him tasting the scent in the cloth, the faintest trace of her fingers still held in the weave after 3 years. Rosemary, copper, wool oil, the salt of honest labor. My mate. The word landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple from it was an answer to a question I had refused to ask. Why the mark never burned for Vesa? Why the keep unraveled? Why the wolves mourned? Why I couldn't sleep, couldn't settle, couldn't feel at home in a hall I had lived in since birth? Because home had packed a cedar chest and walked out into the dark, and I had let her go. I folded the banner carefully, tucked it inside my cloak, and went to the stables. Thorn followed before I called him. I told no one where I was going. I took Thorn, my sword, a bedroll, and the banner. I rode north, because north was the direction my wolf pulled, and I had spent 3 years ignoring him, and I was finished with that. The highlands above Dunmarin are vast and empty, moorland and gray stone, heather and wind, the bones of old cairns on the ridgelines. The border runs through them like a scar, and the villages that cling to the border's edge are small and hard and accustomed to being forgotten by the keeps they serve. I stopped at each one. I described Alara, copper hair, steady hands, a stitcher by trade, quiet, carried a cedar chest. No one recognized the description. I rode for 4 days before Thorn found the trail. We were in the high passes between Dunmarin's Reach and the Ashward Marches, wild country, stone, and scrub, the kind of terrain where a person could disappear if they knew how to live close to the ground. Thorn had been ranging ahead all morning, casting wide loops through the heather, his nose down. At midday he stopped on a ridge and howled, not the border warning howl or the hunt call, but a sound I had only heard once before, when I was a boy and my father's lead wolf had found my mother's trail after she'd been lost in a storm for 2 days. The sound of a wolf who has found what matters. I rode to the ridge. Thorn was standing over a flat stone beside a stream, his tail low and quivering, his nose pressed to the rock. When I crouched beside him, I saw what he had found, a frayed thread caught in a crack in the stone. Crimson. Dunmerran crimson, the exact shade Alara had mixed herself from madder root and iron mordant, a color no one else in the Highlands could match. She had passed this way. Perhaps not recently. The thread was weathered, bleached at the edges, but she had knelt here, perhaps to drink from the stream, and a thread from her work had caught and held. My wolf rose in my chest, and for the first time in 3 years the feeling was not rage. It was direction, purpose, a compass needle swinging north by northwest and locking. I followed the pull. 2 more days. The trail was not a trail in any tracking sense. No footprints, no broken branches, no campsites. It was a feeling, a thinning of the air, a way my wolf leaned into the wind as if scenting something just beyond the next ridge. And then, on the evening of the 6th day, I came over a rise and saw the village. It sat in a green valley between 2 ridges of gray stone, a cluster of low buildings around a mill stream, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, a small flock of sheep on the hillside above. Not a wolf-pack village, a human settlement, or close to it, a mixed community on the Ashward border, too small to have a name on any of Dunmerran's maps, too remote to have been touched by the border wars. I left my horse on the ridge and walked down on foot, Thorn at my side. Halfway down the slope, the wind shifted, and my wolf surged so hard I stumbled. She was here. The scent hit me like the ground after a fall, sudden, absolute, undeniable. Rosemary and copper and wool oil, and beneath it something I had never consciously registered in all those years at Dunmerran, a warmth like sun on linen, like a banked hearth, like the precise moment a held breath releases. My whole body went rigid. My vision sharpened until I could see the grain of the wood on the nearest doorframe. My wolf pressed forward with every ounce of his being, not to run, not to claim, just to be closer. I stopped walking and put my hand on Thorn's head and made myself breathe. She had left without a word. She had chosen to go, and I had been the reason. Whatever instinct was roaring in my chest, it did not give me the right to stride into her life and demand she return. I was the one who had failed to see her. I was the one who had chosen a political alliance over whatever quiet truth had been growing between us, a truth I had been too blind or too busy or too arrogant to notice. If she wanted nothing to do with me, I would accept it. My wolf would have to accept it too. I walked into the village as a stranger. The houses were well kept, the gardens tended, the mill stream running clear. A woman hanging linens looked up as I passed and gave me a cautious nod, a border village nod, the kind that says I see you and I'm deciding whether you're safe. Thorn padded beside me, and the woman's eyes widened at his size, but she didn't retreat. I'm looking for a stitcher, I said, a woman who works with thread and wool, banners, tapestries. The woman studied me. The weaver's house is at the end of the lane, she said, by the ash tree. I followed the lane. The house was small and clean, with a slate roof and a low stone wall around a herb garden. Rosemary grew in thick, fragrant hedges beside the door, the scent that had haunted me for 3 years. An ash tree spread its branches over the yard, and beneath it, on a wooden frame, a half-finished tapestry hung in the afternoon light. The door was open. I stopped at the gate and looked through the doorway, and there she was. Alara Wynne sat at a wide loom in the front room, her back to the door, her hands moving the shuttle in the steady, rhythmic motion I had seen 1,000 times without truly seeing. Her copper hair was pulled back in a loose braid. She wore a plain blue dress, faded at the cuffs, with a leather apron over it. She looked exactly as she had at Dunmarron, composed, focused, unhurried, as if the 3 years between then and now were a single held breath she had not yet released. My wolf lay down. Not settled, not calmed, lay down flat, surrendered, as if every muscle in his body had simply let go at once. The pacing stopped, the rage stopped, the howling stopped. 3 years of fury drained out of me so fast I had to grip the gatepost to stay upright. And what rushed in to fill the space was something so vast and so quiet that I did not have a word for it. She is here, she is alive, she is well. The world made sense again. Alara turned her head. She saw me standing at her gate, a travel-stained alpha with a war wolf at his side, gripping her gatepost as if it were the only thing holding him to the earth, and she did not startle. She did not gasp, did not cry out, did not leap up. She looked at me with those steady gray eyes, and her hands stilled on the shuttle, and she said, "You should not be here, my lord." My lord, not Brennan, not even Alpha. My lord, the formal address of a subject to a king, the distance of duty, the wall of protocol built by a woman who had decided 3 years ago that she would not be a complication. No, I agreed. I should have been here 3 years ago. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she set the shuttle down, wiped her hands on her apron, and stood. "You had better come in," she said, "before the whole village sees the Alpha King of Dunmarron standing in my garden like a lost dog." Behind me, Thorn's tail moved once slow, side to side, and I followed her inside. Her house was small and warm and ordered with the same meticulous care she had brought to every banner she'd ever stitched. A single hearth, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of dried herbs, the loom by the window. The cedar chest, the same one she had carried out of Dunmarron, sat at the foot of a narrow bed in the back room. She had not accumulated much in 3 years. She had not needed to. Alara had always been a woman who could make a world out of very little. She poured water from a clay jug and set it on the table without asking if I wanted it. I sat across from her and drank it because my throat was dust, and because the act of drinking gave me a reason not to speak for a moment. And I needed that moment because my wolf was lying inside me like a creature that had come home after a lifetime in the wild and could not quite believe the warmth. "How did you find me?" she asked. Thorn found a thread, crimson from a Dunmarron standard. On a rock by a stream in the high passes. I set the cup down. "My wolf followed your scent from there. That thread must be 2 years old. I passed through on my way here. I caught my sleeve on the stone." She said it evenly, without surprise, as if the idea that a wolf had tracked a 2-year-old thread across 50 miles of moorland were a perfectly ordinary thing. "He has been looking for you since the night you left," I said. "I was the one who refused to listen." Alara's hands were folded on the table. She did not fidget, she did not look away. "You made a choice, my lord. It was a sound one. The Thornwall Alliance secured the southern pass. And cost me everything else. It cost you a banner stitcher. It cost me you." The silence was long enough for the hearth to pop twice. "You did not know," she said finally. "You did not know what I was to you. I cannot blame a man for failing to see a thing no one told him to look for." "I should have looked anyway," I leaned forward. "The keep has been unraveling since you left, Alara. The banners fray, the stones crack, the wolves pace. My wolf has not settled a single night in 3 years. And I stopped because the next words were the hardest I had ever spoken, and I was a man who had given battlefield orders with arrows in the air. I have not been whole, not once, not for a single hour." She studied me. Her gray eyes gave away nothing. She was as composed as she had ever been, a woman who had built a quiet life in a border village and stitched tapestries for the local families, and needed nothing from the Alpha King who had overlooked her. "What is it you want, Brennan?" she asked. and the use of my name was so unexpected that my wolf lifted his head inside me. "I want to earn the right to ask you to come home." "Earn it," she repeated. I chose wrong. I chose duty over what was true, and I did it because I was too proud or too blind to see what was in front of me. I won't ask you to forgive that. I'll ask for the chance to prove that I see it now. You want me to trust you? I want to give you reasons to. She looked at me for a long time, and I saw the first crack in her composure. Not tears, not anger, but a fine tremor at the corner of her mouth. The kind of tiny movement that costs a person everything to contain. "Stay in the village," she said. "There is a room above the mill that old Haddon rents to travelers. Stay there and we will see." It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was a door left ajar by a woman who had every right to bolt it shut, and I took it as the gift it was. I moved into the room above the mill. The village was called Bryn Mawr, a name I later learned was an old border word meaning the green place between stones. It had no pack structure, no formal wolf bonds. It was a human settlement that tolerated the occasional wolf blood passing through, and its people were cautious and practical and deeply uninterested in the politics of the Highland keeps. They did not know I was the Alpha King. I gave my name as Brennan and said I was from the Highlands and left it at that. Thorn slept beside my door, and the villagers accepted a man with a large wolf the way border people accept all things, with a wary nod and a readiness to help if needed. I stayed for 2 weeks and I did what Alara had asked. I gave her reasons. Not grand ones, not kingly ones. I mended Haddon's fence where the winter storms had taken out a section of post. I helped the miller carry sacks of grain from the storehouse to the grinding floor, work that made my shoulders burn and my pride quiet. I sat in the village common in the evenings and listened to old Merritt tell stories about the border wars, not the versions I knew, not the strategic summaries from my council table, but the versions the border people remembered. The houses burned, the flocks scattered, the children who hid in root cellars for 3 days. I began to understand what Dunmarin's wars had cost the people who lived in their shadow. And every day I visited Alara. Not to press, not to plead. I came to her house in the mornings and asked if she needed anything carried or fixed. The first 3 days she said no. On the 4th day she said there was a shutter that stuck, and I spent an hour planing it smooth while she worked at her loom. On the 5th day she offered me tea, a herbal blend she mixed herself, rosemary and chamomile, and something sharp I couldn't identify, and we sat on either side of her table and drank it in a silence that was not uncomfortable. On the 7th day she showed me the tapestry. She had been weaving it for over a year, she said. It was large, wider than her doorframe, meant for a hall, not a cottage. The design was a landscape, a highland moor under a sky of deep gray, and in the foreground a wolf, a great gray wolf, scarred and patient, sitting on a ridge with its muzzle turned toward a valley where a single light burned in a cottage window. "That's Thorn," I said. "I know." She ran her fingers along the wolf's outline. "He sat outside my door every night for the last year I was at Dunmarin. I thought he was simply old and confused. I know now that he was the only one in that keep who understood what was happening. He was smarter than his alpha. Most wolves are." There was no venom in it. She said it the way she said everything, simply, with a directness that left no room for resentment. Alara did not carry bitterness the way other people carried it. She had folded it up, put it away in the cedar chest, and built a life around its absence. What remained was something quieter and harder to navigate, not anger, but a careful distance, the space a woman puts between herself and a thing that has already hurt her once. I understood that I was not owed forgiveness for finding her. I was not owed anything. The bond pulling in my chest, the mark on my wrist that had never warmed for Vesa, my wolf lying still and patient inside me for the first time in 3 years, none of it gave me a claim. It only gave me a reason to stay, and staying was what I did. On the 10th day, She asked me to help her string the warp for a new project. I knew nothing about weaving. She showed me how to thread the heddles, how to tension the warp, how to pass the shuttle and beat the weft. Her hands guided mine without flinching, the first time she had touched me since I arrived, and where her fingers pressed against the backs of my knuckles, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth fire. My wolf lifted his head, not surging, not claiming, lifting his head the way a creature does when it hears a sound it has been waiting for. "You feel it," she said quietly. I looked at her. She was close, closer than she had allowed herself to be, and her gray eyes were steady but not guarded, not fully guarded. There was something behind the composure, a faint light like a lamp behind a shutter. "I have felt it since I walked through your gate," I said. "You felt it at Dunmerron, too. You just didn't know what it was." She withdrew her hands and stepped back. The bond was forming. It had been forming for years. Every banner I stitched for you, every standard I mended, every hour I spent with thread and wool in a room that was 20 paces from your hall. The bond weaves itself into the work of the hands. It's an old thing. Most alphas never encounter it because most alphas marry their fated mates and the bond resolves quickly. But when the bond is unacknowledged, when the alpha doesn't see, doesn't know, doesn't choose, the bond has to go somewhere. Mine went into the thread. I stared at her. "That's why the banners frayed when you left." The bond was still in the stitches. When I left, the bond pulled away with me, and the thread had nothing to hold it. She paused. "I didn't know it would happen. I didn't plan it. I simply couldn't stay and watch you marry another woman while something inside me was being stitched to you against my will, so I left." And the thread followed. "Against your will. I did not choose the bond any more than you did, Brennan. I was your banner stitcher, a servant. I had no right to want the Alpha King and no expectation of being wanted. When I felt the bond beginning, the warmth in the thread, the way my hands knew what your wolves needed before I was told, the pull I felt when you walked through the hall, I tried to ignore it. When you announced the betrothal, I understood that ignoring it was not enough. So I cut the thread. You left. I left. Without telling me. What would I have told you? That your banner stitcher was in love with you. That the mate bond your wolf was trying to show you had been forming in the hems of your war standards for 3 years. You would have thought me mad. Or worse, you would have pitied me, and I could not have borne your pity. I sat down on the bench beside the loom because my legs would not hold me any longer. 3 years. 3 years of hollowness and rage, and a wolf tearing at my ribs and a keep unraveling thread by thread. And the whole time the answer had been this woman, this quiet, dignified, extraordinary woman, who had loved me without asking for anything, and left me without demanding anything, and built a whole life in a border village because she would rather lose everything than accept being pitied. I would not have pitied you, I said. You didn't see me, Brennan. In 4 years at Dunmerron, you noticed me a handful of times. I was part of the furniture. That is not cruelty. It is simply what happens when a king is busy and a woman is quiet and the world does not arrange itself to put them face to face. But I would not have survived telling you the truth and watching you fail to feel what I felt. I feel it now. I know you do. She looked at me, and for the first time the composure cracked fully, not a collapse but a deliberate opening like a door she chose to unlatch. Your wolf has been lying still since you arrived. I can feel it from here. The bond is alive, Brennan. It has been alive the whole time. It was alive in the thread and alive in your wolves and alive in the stones of your keep. And it has been waiting for you to look at me, truly look at me, since the day I threaded my first needle in your service. I looked at her. Not the way I had looked at her at Dunmerron, the glancing, half-aware acknowledgement of a servant performing a task. I looked at her the way my wolf had been looking at her for years. I saw the copper hair and the gray eyes and the steady hands and the straight back of a woman who had never once begged for anything she deserved. I saw the gentleness that had calmed my wolves and the skill that had held my banners together and the courage that had carried her out of my keep with her dignity intact. I saw the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, and the calluses on her fingers from 1,000 hours at the loom, and the way she held herself like a woman who had learned that she could build a world alone if she had to. And I saw, beneath all of it, the bond, a golden thread running between us, visible not to the eyes but to something deeper, a warmth that started in my chest and ran down my arms and into my hands and out through my fingertips toward her. And I understood at last what my wolf had been trying to tell me since the night she left. She was my mate. She had always been my mate, and every stitch she had ever sewn in my service had been a declaration of the bond I had been too blind to read. "Alara," I said, and the mark on my wrist, the pale, silent oath scar that had never burned for Vesa, caught fire. I gasped and looked down. The scar was glowing a deep, warm gold like sunlight on autumn leaves. It wasn't the thin line I had bitten 3 years ago. It was reshaping, widening, the edges blurring and reforming into a pattern I recognized. A thread. A crimson thread winding around my wrist in the exact pattern of a warp stitch. Alara made a small sound. I looked up and saw her pressing her hand to the inside of her own wrist, where a matching glow was spreading. Gold light through her skin, the same thread pattern, the bond writing itself onto her body in the language of her own craft. The mate mark, the real one. Not bitten, not chosen, not performed in a stone hall before a court of witnesses. Given by whatever force governs the bonds between wolves and the people they choose, written in the only shape that was true for us, the stitch. "Oh," she said softly. We stood there in the light of our own marks, and I did not reach for her. I wanted to, my wolf wanted to, but she had spent 3 years earning the right to her own space, and I would not take it from her now. "I'm not asking you to come back to Dunmoran," I said. "I'm asking you to let me stay." She looked at the mark on her wrist. She looked at the mark on mine. She looked at me, truly looked at me, the way I was looking at her, and what I saw in her eyes was not forgiveness, not yet. It was something better. It was the beginning of trust. "Fix my garden wall," she said. "The north section is leaning." I fixed her garden wall, and the day after that I rethatched a section of her roof that the autumn winds had loosened. And the day after that she asked me to sit with her while she wove, and she talked, for the first time, really talked about her life in Bryn Mawr, the people she had come to care for, the tapestries she had made for the village families, the way the border light changed in winter. She talked about Dunmoran, too, about the years she had spent there, the quiet satisfaction of her work, the wolves who would come to her door at night to lie across her threshold as if guarding something they could not name. "They knew before anyone," she said. "They always know." On the 14th day, a rider came into Bryn Mawr at dawn. I was in Alara's garden, turning the soil for her winter planting. Thorn was lying by the gate. The rider came up the lane at a hard gallop and pulled up short when he saw the wolf, and I recognized the horse before the man, a Dunmoran border mount, lathered and blown. The rider was Corin, one of my patrol captains. He slid from the saddle and stared at me with the expression of a man who has found his king digging in a weaver's garden at the edge of the known world. "My lord," he said. "Report," I said, because some instincts do not turn off. "Ashward raiders. A warband crossed the eastern ridge 2 days ago, 40 strong, mounted, armed. They've been burning homesteads along the border. 3 villages hit already. They're moving west." He looked at the village behind me, toward here. My wolf woke. Not the restless, purposeless waking of the past 3 years, a clear, sharp, focused rising, the wolf of a king who has something to protect. I straightened, dropped the spade, and felt the alpha settle into my spine like armor being buckled. "How far?" "Half a day's ride, maybe less. They're moving fast, raiding for provisions, not territory, hit and run." I looked at Bryn Mawr, a dozen houses, a mill, a flock of sheep, a population of maybe 60, most of them unarmed. No walls, no garrison, no defenses beyond a stone church that might hold 20 people if they packed in. I looked at Alara's house, her loom, her herb garden, the half-finished tapestry of the wolf on the ridge. How many men do we have? The patrol 8, including me. Your guard from Dunmerran is a day behind. I rode ahead. 8 men and 1 alpha against 40 raiders. The arithmetic was simple and bad. Send word to the Dunmerran guard to march double time. Set a watch on the eastern ridge. I need to know the moment they're sighted. I paused. And someone find me a weapon. I left my sword at the mill. Corin's expression shifted from shock to something steadier. The recognition of a captain who has just been given an order by his king, regardless of the setting. He saluted and rode. I went inside to find Alara. She was standing at the loom, but she wasn't weaving. She was looking out the window toward the eastern ridge, and when I came in, she turned to me with the same steady gaze she had given me the first day, the composure that covered everything. Ashward Raiders, she said. It wasn't a question. Border people know the sound of a hard-ridden horse. Moving this way, half a day. She nodded. How many? 40. And you have 8 until my guard arrives from Dunmerran. She was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the room to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, opened it, and drew out a folded cloth. She shook it out, and I saw what it was. The half-finished banner. The Dunmerran war standard she had been stitching the night she left, the crimson wolf with its jaw half done, the thread still holding the shape of her last stitch. I kept it, she said. I told myself it was because the thread was good and I didn't want to waste it, but I think I kept it because it was the last thing I touched that was yours. She sat down at her workbench, threaded a needle and began to stitch. What are you doing? Finishing it. Her hands moved with the speed and certainty I remembered, the shuttle-quick flick of the needle, the precise tension of the thread. You'll need a standard. Your men need to see their banner, and if this is the last thing I stitch for Dunmerran, it will be complete. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her to pack and run, to take the safe road south and let me handle the raiders. But Alara Wynne had left Dunmerran once, because someone else had decided what she was worth, and I would not make that mistake again. Finish it, I said. I'll hold the line. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life, and they were also the clearest. I organized the defense with the resources I had. Corin's 8 men were experienced border wolves, not enough to stop 40 raiders in the open, but enough to slow them if we chose the ground well. I picked a narrowing in the valley a quarter-mile east of the village, where the ridges closed in and the lane ran between 2 walls of stone. A choke point. 40 riders would have to come through in a column, and 8 men in a narrow pass can hold a column. We built what barriers we could, overturned carts, felled saplings, stones piled waist-high. The villagers helped without being asked. Old Haddon brought axes. Merritt brought rope. A woman named Sela, who ran the village's small forge, brought every piece of ironwork she had, hasps, hinges, a broken plowshare, and welded them into crude caltrops on her anvil while her daughter pumped the bellows. No one fled. I had not expected that. Border people are survivors. They know when to run and when to dig in. They looked at the valley, looked at the pass, looked at the 8 wolves and the alpha and the crude barricade, and they chose to stay. Alara stitched through the afternoon. I checked on her once, briefly, between trips to the barricade. The wolf on the banner was taking shape, the jaw complete now, the teeth bared, the eye a single point of crimson that seemed to watch you from wherever you stood. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even in haste, even under threat, her hands were sure and her stitches were perfect. The throat and the chest left, she said without looking up. I'll have it done before they come. I left her to it. The scouts spotted the raiders at dusk. They came over the eastern ridge in a loose column, mounted, torch-bearing, their faces wrapped against the highland cold. I could see the smoke of the villages they'd hit rising behind them in thin gray columns, and my wolf bared his teeth inside me, and the alpha in my blood settled into the cold, certain clarity that comes before a fight. 8 men, a barricade of carts and stones and Sila's caltrops, and behind us, a village of 60 unarmed people and a woman finishing a banner by firelight. "Hold the pass," I told Corin. "Don't let them through. Buy time until the guard arrives." "And you, my lord?" "I'll be at the front." The fight was ugly and close and real. The raiders hit the barricade at a gallop and found it harder than they expected. The caltrops took 3 horses in the first wave, and the narrowing of the pass forced them into a knot where their numbers couldn't spread. My men fought from behind the stone walls, using the terrain, making the raiders pay for every foot. I fought at the center. I will not glorify it. War is not glorious. It is necessary sometimes, and it is terrible always, and the only thing that makes it bearable is knowing what you are protecting. I knew. Every time I swung the borrowed blade, not my own sword, a heavy thing from Sila's forge that handled like a fence post, I felt the bond in my wrist burn, and I knew that behind me, a quarter-mile down the valley, a woman was stitching a wolf's chest in crimson thread, and every stitch was a line drawn between me and home. The raiders pulled back after the first assault, regrouped, and came again. We lost 2 of the stone barriers. We held. They came a third time in the dark, trying to slip riders along the ridge to flank us. Thorn caught the flankers. I heard his howl from the ridge, the deep, tearing howl of a war-wolf in his element, and 3 of the raiders' horses bolted and threw their riders into the rocks. We held. At midnight, bruised and bleeding from a cut above my eye that made everything on the left side of my face red and sticky, I heard the sound I had been fighting for. The Dunmarin horn, deep and resonant, echoing off the valley walls. My guard had arrived, 25 mounted wolves, armored and furious, crashing into the raiders' rear like a wave hitting a breakwater. The fight was over in minutes after that. The Ashward warband broke and scattered, fleeing east, leaving their wounded and their torches in the pass. Corin's men gave chase to the ridge and let them go. I sat down on the barricade and breathed. The cut above my eye was deeper than I'd thought, and my left arm was stiff where a raider's spear had caught the edge of my shoulder. Nothing grave, nothing that wouldn't heal. The village was intact. The mill was standing. Alara's house, with its rosemary hedges and its ash tree and its loom, was untouched. Corin found me there. "My lord, the village is secure." "Casualties?" "2 of ours wounded, neither badly. Haddon took a knock from a piece of flying stone. He's complaining about it already, so he's fine. No villagers hurt." "Good," I stood. "Hold the perimeter until dawn. Send a party after the wounded raiders, disarm them and send them walking. I don't want prisoners." "Yes, my lord," he paused. "She finished the banner." I turned. Alara was standing at the end of the lane, and in her hands she held the war standard of Dunmarin. The crimson wolf blazed on the dark field, complete from jaw to chest to tail, every stitch perfect, every line alive. The thread caught the torchlight and gleamed like something molten, and in the dim, fire-lit air of the valley it looked less like a banner and more like a living thing. A wolf made of thread and courage, and 3 years of a bond that refused to die. She walked toward the barricade. My men parted for her without being told. Corin stepped aside. Even the horses shifted, turning their heads to watch her pass. And the wolves, every wolf on that field, mine and Thorn's and the gray Highland wolves who had come with the guard, turned toward her. All of them at once. 30 wolves, scattered across the valley in the aftermath of the fight, lifted their heads and turned toward the woman carrying the banner. Not growling, not howling, simply turning the way flowers turn toward light, drawn by something older and deeper than command. Alara stopped in front of me. The banner hung from her hands, the wolf's crimson eye level with my chest. She looked at the cut above my eye and the blood on my face and the borrowed blade still in my hand, and for the first time since I had found her, her composure was not a wall. It was something else, something open and raw and fierce. "You stayed," she said. "I will always stay. You fought for this village. These people are not your pack, they are not your subjects, they owe you nothing." "They are yours," I said. "That makes them mine." She held out the banner. I took it, and the moment my hands closed on the cloth, the mate mark on my wrist flared a deep, burning gold that lit the valley like a second sunrise. Ilara's mark answered, glowing through the sleeve of her dress, and the light ran between us like a thread pulled taut, a line of gold connecting her wrist to mine, her work to my hands, her bond to my blood. The wolves lay down. Every wolf on that field, 30 of them, gray and scarred and battle-tested, lay down in the trampled grass and the mud and the broken ground, and they pressed their muzzles to the earth and they were still. Thorn lay at Ilara's feet. My men stared. Corin, who had served me for 15 years and had never seen the full pack submit to anyone but me, took a step back and put his hand on his heart. Ilara looked at the wolves. She looked at the mark on her wrist. She looked at me. "I stitched the bond into the banner," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to. I never mean to. But the bond goes where the thread goes, and the thread goes where my hands go, and my hands," she stopped. "My hands have always been yours, Brennan, even when I left, even when I tried to cut the thread. It grew back." I drove the banner's staff into the ground. The standard of Dunmerran, planted in the soil of a village that had no name on my maps, in front of a woman who had been invisible to me for 4 years, and had been the center of my world for the last 3. Then I knelt. Not the kneeling of a supplicant, the kneeling of a king, deliberate, chosen, public. I knelt in the mud and the torchlight, in front of my men and the villagers and the 30 wolves lying in the grass, and I looked up at Ilara Wynne. "I should have seen you," I said. "I should have known. I failed and you paid for it, and nothing I do will undo that, but I see you now. I see you, Ilara, not the banner stitcher, not the servant. I see the woman who loved me quietly and left me with dignity and built a life out of nothing and finished my standard under siege because she would not leave anything unfinished. I see my mate." She looked down at me and her eyes were bright and her hands were steady, and the composure that had carried her through 3 years of exile broke, not into tears, not into a cry, but into a smile. A real one. The first one I had ever seen on her face, and it was worth every mile of the search, every sleepless night, every moment of the hollow years. "Get up, Brennan," she said. "Kings don't kneel in the mud. This one does. This one will for you, for as long as you let me." She reached down and put her hands on either side of my face, her calloused, capable, beautiful hands, and she lifted me to my feet. "Then take me home," she said. We rode into Dunmerran 3 days later, at dawn. I had sent Corin ahead with word, and the keep was ready, not the formal, ceremonial readiness of a planned arrival, but something quieter. The gates were open. The courtyard was swept. The household staff stood along the walls, and among them, at the far end of the courtyard, Vesa of Thornwall waited with her own traveling trunks packed, her expression composed and, I thought, relieved. She had kept her word. The alliance with Thornwall held, restructured around trade and garrison agreements, not a marriage bond. Her father, the pragmatist, had signed the new terms without sentiment. Vesa herself had overseen the transition with the same efficient grace she had brought to everything. She had been a fine partner in governance, and she had been honest when I could not be, and I owed her more than I could say. She nodded to me as we rode in. Then she looked at Ilara sitting straight-backed on the horse beside mine, wearing her faded blue dress and her leather apron, her copper hair in its loose braid, and nodded to her, too. "The banners need mending," Vesa said. "I'm told no one else can manage it." Ilara looked up at the great hall. The war standard, I remembered, the massive crimson and charcoal banner behind the alpha seat, was barely a rag now, threads hanging loose, the wolf's face almost entirely unraveled. "I can see that," Alara said. Vessa's mouth twitched. "Welcome to Dunmurren, my lady." She left that afternoon, her trunks loaded onto a Thornwall wagon, her own wolves flanking her carriage. I walked her to the gate and thanked her, and she said, "Don't waste it this time, Brennan." And that was the last time I saw her. The keep changed the moment Alara crossed the threshold. I felt it in the stones, a settling, a sighing, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. The cracked hearthstones in the great hall sealed overnight, the lines closing as if they had never existed. The courtyard well ran clear. The doors that had stuck for 3 years swung freely. And the banners, the ragged, fraying, unraveling banners that no stitcher could repair, lay still on their rods, waiting. Alara set up her workbench in the room beside the linen stores, the same narrow room she had lived in before, though I offered her any chamber in the keep. She said she liked the light, and the proximity to the thread stores, and the view of the courtyard, and I understood that she was not ready to move into the Alpha's quarters. Not yet, not until the thing between us had been given time to grow in the open. I did not press. She mended the Great Hall standard first. I watched her from the doorway, watched her thread the needle with Dunmurren crimson, watched her hands move in the old rhythm, watched the wolf's face reform stitch by stitch under her fingers. The thread held. It sank into the cloth and stayed, and where it went, the fabric tightened and healed, and the banner that had been a ruin for 3 years was whole again in an afternoon. Thorn lay across the threshold of her room, and did not move until she was finished. In the days that followed, the pack came to her. Not formally, Dunmurren's wolves did not stand in a line and present themselves. They simply came. One by one, then in pairs, then in groups, the gray Highland wolves who had paced and whined and circled the keep for 3 years padded to her door, pressed their noses to her hands, breathed her scent and settled. They lay in the corridor outside her room. They followed her to the great hall. They sat at her feet while she stitched, and their eyes were calm, and their breathing was slow, and the restless energy that had infected the whole pack for 3 years drained away like water finding its level. The people of the keep noticed. They had known Alara as the banner stitcher, a quiet servant, competent and unremarkable. Now they watched the wolves follow her, and the banners heal under her hands and the hearthstones mend themselves, and they began to understand what the wolves had known all along. She was the heart of this keep. She always had been. I announced her as my Luna on a still morning in late autumn, in the great hall, before the full court. There was no ceremony, no ritual bite, no oath mark. The real mark, the golden thread pattern that wound around both our wrists, had been given by the bond itself and needed no performance. I simply stood beside her in front of the hall and said, "This is Alara Wynne, and she is my mate. The bond chose her before I had the wisdom to see it, and she had the grace to wait until I did. She is your Luna." The hall was quiet. And then Thorn, old Thorn, scarred and gray and patient beyond measure, walked to the center of the hall and lay down at Alara's feet and pressed his muzzle to the stone. One by one, every wolf in the keep followed. The court bowed after the wolves did not before. The wolves decided and the people followed, and it was right. It was always going to be the wolves. Alara looked at me. The mark on her wrist glowed faintly, a golden thread that matched the one on mine, and her gray eyes were steady and warm and at last unguarded. "You see me now," she said. "I see you," I said. "I will not stop." That was 5 years ago. The banners of Dunmurren have not frayed since. The Great Hall standard hangs behind the Alpha seat, the crimson wolf complete and whole, and if you look closely at the stitchwork, the jaw, the teeth, the single watching eye, you can see where the old thread meets the new, where the work she began in a narrow room beside the linen stores joins the work she finished in a border village under siege. The seam is invisible to most. I can find it with my eyes closed. She still stitches. She has a proper workshop now, with wide windows and good light, and the cedar chest sits in the corner, and Thorn, too old now to patrol, too stubborn to admit it, sleeps beside her workbench every afternoon while she weaves. The tapestry of the wolf on the ridge hangs in our chamber. The wolf's muzzle is still turned toward the valley, toward the cottage window with its single light, but she added to it after she came home. In the sky above the ridge, if you look, there is a second shape, not a wolf, but a thread. A golden thread winding through the gray sky like a stitch through cloth, connecting the ridge to the valley, the wolf to the light. The bond made visible. I asked her once if she ever regretted leaving Dunmoran that night. She was sitting at the loom, the shuttle in her hands, the late afternoon light turning her copper hair to fire. She thought about it the way she thinks about everything seriously, without rushing. "No," she said, "if I had stayed, you would have pitied me. Or worse, you would have done the honorable thing and kept me close out of duty, and the bond would have grown in silence, and we would both have spent our lives wondering what it might have been if you had chosen me freely." She passed the shuttle through the warp. "You needed to lose me before you could find me, and I needed to know that I could survive the losing." I watched her hands, the steady, sure, calloused hands that had held my keep together and would hold it together for the rest of our lives. "I would search again," I said, 100 times 1,000. She smiled the real smile, the one I had first seen in a torchlit valley with 30 wolves lying in the grass. "I know," she said. "That's why I opened the door. I sit beside her sometimes in the workshop while she weaves. I do not speak. I do not need to. The shuttle moves and the thread passes through the warp, and the bond between us hums in the quiet like a low, sustained note from somewhere deep in the stone, and my wolf, the wolf who raged for 3 years and lay still the moment she came home, rests his head on my knee and breathes." She looks up from the loom. Our eyes meet across the room, across the years, across the silence that was never really silence but a thread being woven, slowly and patiently, by hands that knew what they were making long before the rest of us understood. "And there is nowhere else I need to be."